Hey everybody, first of all I want to say that I feel super accomplished today because not only did I bind my first book and create a whole book from scratch, but I also fixed the lav mic I bought many months ago that just suddenly stopped working. However, today I am creating, or rather I already created a mini sketchbook. I didn't go out and buy anything. I wanted to see if I could use what I already had in the house to create a mini sketchbook. I had a lot of sketch paper laying around, I had some vinyl leather and cardstock that I bought for another project and so forth, and I'm going to talk you through the process that I went through. Anyways, I digress. Let's get to creating a miniature sketchbook. The first thing I had to do was prepare the paper for actual binding. So I took some sketch paper that I had laying around that actually came out of an old sketchbook that had the spine break, and I had to cut it to double the size I wanted each page to actually be. I used a scalpel to do this. It was pretty easy using an aluminum ruler to make sure that my cuts were perfectly straight. And then I had to fold those over, trying to keep them as perfect as possible and make sure that each set of folded pages were all as close to the same as possible. This would make putting the book together a lot easier and just make it look better. Once that was done, I wanted to make sure these were as flat as possible. So I took each folded page one by one and burnished the crease down with that ruler as well. There's probably a better way to do this, but I am me. And after that was done, I had to line them all up perfectly, and I used the scalpel again to cut registration marks in the pages. I assume that's what these are supposed to be. This is so that later I can run a rope of some kind through that crease to make sure that as I'm sewing the pages together, that they stay aligned and don't skew too much. Again, there's probably a better way to do this, but this is how I did it. And then I needed to puncture 4 holes in each one of these pages, and they all needed to be exactly the same, again for alignment, and I needed to do one on either side of where this rope would be laying. And once that was done, I had to, one by one, sew these pages together in what I believe is called signatures. In bookbinding, I think there are like 3 terms for the pages. There is pages, signatures, and a text block. Pages are like single pages, a signature is a group of pages, and a text block is the entire combination of all the pages and signatures together. Don't quote me on that though, I'm still learning. I don't have an actual book press, so I kind of just made one with a clamp and 2 pieces of acrylic. It's not entirely fancy, but it gets the job done for a book this small. The next thing for me to do, because despite my sewing job, everything was still a little bit loose, I wanted to coat the entire spine in wood glue for strength purposes, so I clamped the book down, making sure things stayed as aligned as possible, compressing that spine down and using my finger to coat it with some wood glue and letting it dry. Now my sewing job acted as the main hold together of all these signatures and pages, but the glue made sure that there were no gaps and that those seams or those creases wouldn't actually separate from each other. And to solidify that further, I ended up gluing a piece of fabric onto the spine as well, just for a little more security. And at this point, everything was looking pretty good, and it was starting to function like an actual book, and I was feeling so inspired to push through even farther. And despite my temptation to be overly ambitious, I decided against making it more complicated than it actually needed to be. The next step was for me to cut out the cardstock that was going to make the hardcover portion of this sketchbook, which meant taking some thick cardboard that I had laying around, cutting it slightly larger than the pages themselves, and then gluing that on. Then once the glue was applied to the pages, I needed to clamp this down to make sure everything dried flat, keeping a piece of parchment paper in between the first and second page of the sketchbook so I don't accidentally glue a bunch of pages together. I'm impressed with myself for remembering to do that because I never remember to do the protective safety stuff when it comes to gluing things up. One mistake. It seems that while it was clamped, something shifted. This side didn't shift, which is strange because I did this side the exact same way that I did the other side, but apparently something shifted. And with that mistake fixed and everything glued back up properly, I was able to move forward with this. And what I did was I took a piece of black cardstock and bent it to about the shape that I intended the spine to be in so that I could cover the glued up spine and the fabric with a piece of solid material that has the curve already built into it so that when I later wrap it in the vinyl leather, it'll just look a little bit nicer. This was a tedious process because I couldn't figure out how to bend the cardstock without it cracking. I didn't know cardstock could crack, but apparently it can. And then once that was done and everything was clamped and glued up, it was time to actually start wrapping it in vinyl leather. It just so happened that I had the perfect size of leftover vinyl leather from a past project to actually do this. So I just wanted to kind of mark out about the size that I would need for it. Turns out I probably shouldn't have cut off as much material as I did, but it didn't end up causing any actual problems in the end. Once that was dry, it was time to coat the hardcover portions of this book with glue and fold the leather over the rest of the way, and then making sure that it's perfectly flat with no creases, put it back into my makeshift press and let that dry for at least an hour. Then I had to go through the tedious process of folding the edges of this leather over into the book. And while I should have probably glued these in place, and I could have used hot glue, I decided on double-sided tape because the normal glue would take way too long to dry and I'd have to clamp each edge as I work, which is just more work than I want to deal with. And hot glue isn't flat. So I used this archival art tape, which held really, really well, definitely long enough for me to start putting the cardstock backing onto the inside of the book to hide the edges of the leather, because honestly, it looked gross. So I cut out some black Bristol board to use as sort of an internal covering, which ended up looking amazing. I actually used more double-sided tape to put on the inside of the book to at least hold the paper in place so it doesn't shift or skew while I'm clamping it up. And then I used white school glue around the entire thing to, hold it in place more securely. I'm not very good at describing my processes. Anyways, once that was glued up, the book was pretty much done, but there was one final detail I wanted to add to this book. And that final detail with these little gold plated corner things that are actually for leather, but I figured it worked perfectly for this, and I'm so glad I made the decision to put them on because it makes this thing look like I bought it from somebody else who knows what they're doing. I used a pair of needle nose pliers very carefully to pinch these down so they don't slide off. That way I can avoid having to glue these in place too, because more glue means more chance for mess. And then because a certain portion of the book didn't look really great because I didn't know how to wrap the leather there, I just kind of took some yellow embroidery floss and just kind of looped it around to make it look better. There's a name for what this part of the book is called, but I have no idea what it is. And once that was done, I went inside and I dated when I started creating the book, when I finished it, and signed my name because I want to be able to look back on this in the future and compare it to all the new books I'm going to make and really kind of have something to look back on and realize how much I've improved. And we're back, and this is the little mini sketchbook that I made. I have to say that I am so happy with how polished it looks. Of course, there's like some scuffs, and I didn't do everything absolutely proper or perfect, but look at this thing. This is like an actual functional little book. It opens all the way everywhere. Like, this functions like an actual little hardcover sketchbook, and I made this, and it only took me like an accumulation of maybe 7 hours. I'm like, this is amazing. Anyways, in conclusion, I really hope you enjoyed this video. I definitely enjoyed creating it. And if you want to see more stuff from me, you can click that subscribe button and the bell notification so you get notified when I upload something else. I do have a Patreon, which I mainly created to help give some behind the scenes stuff to people who want to support the creation of my animated film and eventual cartoon series. I've been Dragon Boy, you've been incredible. Consider supporting me on Patreon, and I will see you guys next time. I'm gonna sketch in my sketchbook. I'm such a child.